Craig, good to see you. Thanks for doing this.
Michael, great to be here.
I have to tell you, I've done over 1,100 and change episodes now. You and I spoke back in August of 22, and I distinctly remember the conversation you and I had for two reasons. And I was talking about this on Monday, or not, today's Wednesday, Monday, when you had the outage in Spain, Portugal, and parts of France. And it's another reminder for me why I need to not be in, I live in Arizona, why I need to not be in Arizona. And you probably don't remember, but one of the funniest things you said, which made complete sense, you're like, Mike, you moved to a place where there's no water. What did you think? There's plenty of water in the United States, but the problem is, how do we get that on trucks and get it over to you?
Yeah, it's a supply chain issue. I always think about that, Mike, whenever I'm thinking about anything in the world of context of supply chain.
Well, and the other thing is too. So that was the first time. I've never forgotten when you said it to me, Craig. I mean, I literally think about it all the time. Why did I move to a place where there's no water? Because this city, in my opinion, was never designed to handle this many millions of people. Las Vegas too, because there's no water.
Yeah, for sure.
And if something,
so much of civilization is geography. Geography is destiny, as they say, and. In my world of supply chain, everything is geography. And so I think about these things all the time.
And if something were to happen, this city, 95% of it would be dead. And, over the last 4 or 5 years, East Palestine, Western North Carolina, Lahaina, LA, you can't be naive to think that something might not happen. And can you imagine in Las Vegas, if the power were to go out on the Strip? They would be animals. They would literally
absolute chaos.
Eat each other,
especially in Vegas. Yeah, when you've overconsumed, and Vegas is kind of an interesting kind of crazy city, anyways. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it is an interesting time because in many ways, sort of modern civilization has defied physics and defied gravity and defied the way we have built the society because of things like fossil fuels and our ability to sort of exploit natural resources. And yet we're so vulnerable if those things get disrupted. And that's really, at the end of the day, what a supply chain is like making sure that we can live a modern life. I mean, the reality is, I think most modern humans would probably not survive more than a week if the power completely went out. Like, we are just so accustomed to living in this world where we have all these comforts. We are not ready to be out in the woods the way our ancestors were. Now, I suspect that maybe a week is an exaggeration, but it would certainly wouldn't take long for a lot of people to be very uncomfortable.
Well, and I had a friend of mine who experienced he lives in Western North Carolina, and he didn't have power for 10 days. And he said, one of the biggest thing, it's not the generator. Everybody goes to the generator, but good luck getting that thing filled up if power's out and everybody else has generators. Access to clean water. So it's made me think to myself, I'm like, I'm in literally probably one of the worst places in America to live.
You're in an incredibly vulnerable spot. And like, if there is some kind of event and the power goes out, then your gasoline pumps won't work. So you can't drive out of the town. Your battery electric cars aren't going to be able to get charged. You're kind of in a really vulnerable position. You think about this from a national security standpoint. If you are Chinese or Russian planners and military planners, then you're definitely looking at American vulnerabilities, and absolutely Phoenix and Las Vegas and Los Angeles are sort of top of your list because they're very easy to sort of cut off because they're so dependent upon all of our infrastructure to sort of exist.
Well, then you factor do that in July or August, right? To just triple whammy it when it's 115 or 118. And here's the other thing. You've been here before, right?
I have.
You've been to Flagstaff and Sedona and all that?
I have, yeah.
So the I-17, and then you can take the I-10 to go east or west. Good luck if there's 6 million people. If, let's say your car is working and you have full tank.
You're in the mountains. You're at elevation. In fact, I did a road trip from Waco, Texas, where I went to school, to San Diego, and we actually stopped at the Grand Canyon in Flagstaff. And I remember it was March, it was snowing in Arizona, and I was just at that point really didn't understand the geography of the state of Arizona. and I was kind of shocked that it was snowing. I thought it was cool snowing here in the desert. But yeah, it is amazing. And no one talks about these things because everyone's so accustomed to things just working. And I think this is really the work that I do at FreightWaves is we think about the supply chain on a daily basis. We understand it because we live it and breathe it. I think for the most people, they look at supply chain as if they look at the power company. You don't think about a supply chain until it doesn't work. Just like you don't think about your power company or your water company unless things aren't working. And then all of a sudden you realize how dependent you are on it. And so it's just a interesting a transition because you're talking about exactly what we end up doing.
And people are so blissfully unaware, Craig, that
and they should be. I mean, the whole point of what happens in supply chain, what happens with utility companies, what happens with the water companies is we have this very complex economy that enables people who work in these industries to be specialists and experts. And it works so well because of the people that work in these industries, but you're supposed to not notice it or think about it. And that's when it works at its best, is when you don't think about it. It should be a thankless job. It should be, because that means it's all working and you can forget that you even did it. But when you turn on your power on the switch, there is a whole system and a supply chain that enable that to happen. It's instantaneous to us, but the reality is this modern world. Imagine taking someone from 1,000 years ago, from the dark ages, and bringing them into the modern society. They would be, everything around them would be so different than the world that they were accustomed to, that it would almost feel like they're in an alien civilization because of how things just work. And we're so fortunate to live in an age when that takes place because it works so well.
What were your thoughts when you saw the power outage in Europe in relation to your work?
I think ultimately, so there's two ways to look at it. One is most likely I always go to Occam's razor, which is the right explanation is usually the most simplest. Is probably, in my sort of initial reaction to that, is this is most likely some type of computer system malfunction that happened, was my initial reaction. You start to read some of the stuff, and you're realizing that a lot of it is because the grids, particularly in Europe, and we saw this in Texas a couple of years ago when things got really cold, is we see this in California, is the move to basically net zero or to decarbonize the grid means that you don't have a lot of incremental capacity. The turbines are not turning up. The supply chain to supply electricity is not, most of that is offline because it's either been decommissioned or not running. That when you have disruptions of some sort for whatever reason, then you end up with basically the system failing. I'm so focused right now on the Trans-Pacific trade and the tariffs and trade. I haven't spent enough time reading this, but what I do understand is that something disrupted the power system. There isn't enough incremental capacity, or there was a lot of capacity, but it wasn't turned on for some of the other sort of supplemental traditional forms of energy. And that's why effectively it shut down. Now that's sort of my very simple, without going too deep. In a supply chain orientation where I'm at is, and I've seen some people who have gone and had this conversation on social media, is that this must be an intentional attack by some, either the Chinese, the North Koreans, or most likely the Russians are doing it to disrupt the economy and it's sort of a soft form of terrorism, if you will, cyber terrorism, to really try to demonstrate that they can cripple the economy. This also happened to happen at the same time that Newark's airport was shut down because they had their own problems, and it just coincidentally happened. Apparently there was another issue. I can't remember where it was. I was reading about this morning really briefly, where there was another power issue. I think it was in the UK. It was a small town or city had some problems as well. And so it does lead you into this sort of theory that these may be national security. And like I've said this before, is we're in the second Cold War, and we've been in the second Cold War really since 2022. And you could even argue really since 2018, we've been in a bit of a Cold War. But supply chains are the front lines. And in a Cold War, and you saw this in the first Cold War, if you want to disrupt your enemy, it is a lot easier to do that by attacking their infrastructure and their economy than it is to actually go out and kill them. Because frankly, the cost of going out and attacking, being in a military action, particularly with a company or a country, and even the NATO alliance or even these European powers, that's a really expensive and damaging thing because you're putting your own assets at risk, right? But when you're talking about an environment where you're attacking someone's grid or you're attacking someone's energy system or a pipeline or container shipping vessels or whatever, or airports, you're causing disruptions, but the cost of doing so is pretty insignificant to you. So those types of actions in this sort of the second Cold War are going to continue to play out. And we're seeing this. I mean, what I spend a lot of time on right now is this whole trade war, which could turn hot. And you look at throughout history, so many wars have broken out, have started out as trade disputes and economic disputes, and they actually escalate into something much hotter. And that's the thing that I think is hard for people that grew up in sort of this post-Cold War era, or even since the 1950s, to sort of think about the fact that we have lived in a pretty remarkable time in history where we haven't had to worry about these sort of military actions. I mean, certainly the United States has been at war for much of its history, and certainly in recent, but these are very isolated. The wars are happening in other parts of the world that are pretty remote to us and don't directly impact our lives unless you serve in the military. And in some ways, we now have an adversary or a set of adversaries in China and in Russia that can inflict real damage to us. And I think the trade war is what we're seeing with the trade war is exactly that, which is there are two counterparties that have opposing interests but have an enormous amount of economic dependency on one another. And there is a inevitability that the alliances, the trade alliances, are going to fracture. And that's what we're starting to see. And it seems so foreign to us because we're so used to living in a world where trade was continuing to flowing between two parties. And this is a really unusual time in history.
This episode is brought to you by McIlvaney Financial Group. Their advisors bring a depth of knowledge and experience that allow them to serve their clientele with care, ensuring their financial needs are met now and in the future. Personally, I'm not saying cash is worthless, but you can see what's happening. It's worth less every year. Gold is the opposite. Click on the promo link in the show notes or go to www.mcilvaney.com/coffeeandamike. Well, and you wrote, the other thing that, I remember about our first conversation, how it ties into this, when you started your show, and I put Sal Mercogliano also in this group because his channel is just blown up. And
absolutely,
wasn't it you that said, I think it was you that said, people had said to you, who cares about supply chain logistics? Who's going to want to watch a show about supply chain logistics?
Well,
who cares about shipping?
I mean, it's amazing because, Sal is I think Sal started that show during COVID. I don't remember it may have been the Suez Canal was sort of was the catalyst for Sal. But, here's a topic about shipping. Like, who cares? In his world, in my world, it's supply chains, which is cargo movement. When I set out to start FreightWaves in 2016, there were so many people who were like, how could you build a media business based on supply chain? That sounds really boring. And I probably talked to over 100 venture capitalists before I got my first yes, where we were trying to raise money. And it was so hard to justify that we should even exist. And it was interesting. It was like, well, if this I think there's a tendency in a lot of venture capital world where, and investors do this, is they sort of pattern recognize. They want to go in and invest in the winners and the companies that are going to break out and something that is unique, but they also don't want to be the first to write the check. And so when we were showing up, because their questions are like, why, if this is so obvious, then why hasn't somebody else done it? And so we're having this case that, like, supply chains are disrupted, freight is very volatile, and no one really understood that. We understood it. And I remember I would get in these conversations with these venture capitalists who would argue with me. There was one guy at a venture fund, and I know the guy, and I've talked to him a lot since, that basically by halfway through the conversation started arguing with me about how the trucking market works. Like, this guy knows nothing. He's never spent time probably in a truck. And he just keeps arguing with me, and he says, "You know nothing about trucking." This is what he says to me. And I'm like, okay, well, you absolutely know nothing, but we'll leave it aside. Now this guy calls me on a regular basis wanting to ask my advice on some trucking issue. So it is interesting because I think a lot of people have just the thought of being around the supply chain. It sounds like a really boring topic. And my wife used to say, don't talk about freight when we're at, when we go out to parties, because it's kind of boring. That's what people want to talk about now. It's now a recurring conversation. Which is somewhat an unusual time for me. And it's been cool. It's been cool to be a part of it.
And this has been going on now for a number of years, right? I mean, because COVID.
So FreightWaves started in 2000. I started the business in 2016. We launched our first media, in those days it was a blog. It was like one person writing about it in 2017. Concept came about in 16, 17. And it was a pretty slow, for us, it felt like we were growing really fast. But if I look back at it now, it feels much slower. It feels much more sort of a slow build. Didn't feel that way in those days. And it's weird when you build a business, you get all these little victories along the way, and you're like, this is such a big deal. Like, the local newspaper is writing a story about you, or there's like a 3-minute segment on the local news or something. And now it's completely different. But I've been doing this for 8 years now, and it's been a pretty remarkable time. And I remember we hired a journalist. Actually, he wasn't a journalist. He got his PhD in Chaucer, in 16th century history or something. And he said to me, this was 2018, I think, and this is well before COVID. This was really early in our business, and he's like, did you ever imagine all these things would be happening in freight? Did you ever think about that when you started the business? And he'd only been doing it maybe 6 months. And I looked at him and said, dude, there's always something happening in this business, but everyone takes it for granted because it works so well. And that's my job at FreightWaves, is to provide context to these stories so that people do understand what's happening, so that they do get to sort of get a firsthand account on how this stuff works. Because it's not as if, what's going to happen right now, trade is a really important conversation. They're going to be a continuation of these types of stories. But, in a couple of months, people are going to get bored of hearing about tariffs, and then, they're going to go on to something else. And they're going to, a large part of the audience that we have right now is going to go, stop coming and being interested in this topic. But then something, maybe a year from now will happen and it brings it back. And our job is to make sure that we stay informed and stay in the middle of that, so that when these things do happen, people have a resource for it.
Well, and this, first of all, let me congratulate you on the success of your channel and your media company, because it's been my go-to, especially as these events have come across, to find out information, and also to Sal. I mean, I've had Sal on here a bunch, and part of that is because you were willing to come on before him. So I thank you for that. Also, you had written on X, talking about when Trump got elected, we voted for this. I'm assuming you said in terms of what yourself too.
I did. I was, yeah.
And you're like, I didn't vote to have supply chain and small business operators get completely decimated in the first 100 days.
Yeah, a neutron bomb is what think about the neutron bomb, is it goes off and basically you end up with everything's everything dies, everything living dies, but you still have the infrastructure. And that's effectively what's happened is these tariffs are so detrimental to the supply chains and so detrimental to businesses is they basically, the ships are still around, the railroads are still around, the trucks are still there, but there's no freight or cargo inside them. And that's really, that's the way, when I think of a neutron bomb, that's the kind of picture, is this sort of empty world. And that's what we've got is we've got this real abrupt change. We have an extreme version of Donald Trump's politics. We have an extreme version of his policies that is in many ways different than it is absolutely different than the first administration. And I think different than what most people who voted for him, not all, but many people who are sort of in the sort of center, politically center, that voted for Donald Trump just didn't expect. Now, obviously, if you're on the left, you're like, well, you deserve this because you voted for the guy. You're getting what you deserve. But I think most of the population sort of sits somewhere in the middle. And, Donald Trump was very successful being able to get sort of independent voters to buy into the story that we're going to have pro-business policies. And I'm included in that. And it seemed like that was the much better option than the alternative. And what we've ended up with is an extreme version of Donald Trump's policies, particularly with trade, is where we're seeing it play out first and foremost. And I think it's actually quite concerning.
Well, and as we look at last day of April when we're recording this, has it gotten to a place yet now where the damage, no matter what, even let's say everything were reversed today, is the boat too far out there to?
No, not necessarily. I mean, look, you're going to have degrees of impact, but the more that this goes, the more damage that's going to happen. I mean, here's the problem is that businesses are sort of stuck in this indecision pattern. And I think in some ways, if you ran a business that's dependent upon China, you're sort of dealing with the 5 stages of grief, which is denial. In denial, it was shock and then denial. What are the 5 stages of grief? I think shock and then denial. And so I think a lot of business owners are sort of in this denial phase that, okay, we're eventually going to get a deal. It's going to work out. I don't need to do anything. And I think that is the wrong place for them to live, because what I think is apparent, and I wrote this back in 2022 when Biden was in office, is that we are in a second Cold War, and this globalization, this continuing move to free markets, is a relic of the past. It's a relic of a different generation. So even if we end up in a situation where we do get a trade deal, I think as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, anybody with dependencies on China should understand that this is going to continue to be a battlefield, and you're going to continue to face disruptions. And I think most people want it just to go back to the way it was. And it's just not going to, even if we get some reprieve, even if we all of a sudden we wake up tomorrow and we get a tweet from Donald Trump on Truth Social where he's got a 25% tariff on China. That doesn't mean in the future that A, it isn't subject to change, and B, it's not subject to disruption, because now we have to deal with all of the other geopolitical issues that could come from this, as well as the fact that now China, we've escalated the tension between the United States and China, and therefore there is going to be continuation of fallout in that. And so it feels like I wouldn't say in an irreversible period of time, but we're certainly not going to put the genie back in the bottle. Like this is a new era. And I think we'll look back, hopefully we're all around in 5 years, and we'll look back and Mike, you still have water in the desert and power in the desert. We'll look back and be like, okay, this was when it all started. Or it really started back in 2022 and very few people realized it. But that's where we're at. I mean, fundamentally, I just think we're in a new era, and I just don't think most people are ready for that.
I agree. I was looking down to look up the 5 stages of grief. It's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
So we're in the denial phase. That's the first one, right? So bargaining, I think there's a lot of founders and entrepreneurs that are bargaining. Like Like, just win, like, just declare victory and give me back my stuff, basically. So I'm sure there's a lot of founders that are there. At some point, you got to realize that like there is a permanent shift in the economy, and you have got to prepare for that.
So you don't think we're close to the acceptance stage?
Oh no, I don't think anyone's. I'm not even close to acceptance. I mean, I've been dealing with this issue, monitoring it for, like I said, for 7 years, and I still have a problem with. I gave speeches years ago talking about that this is where we're going to end up in a trade embargo of some sort. Now, the way I imagined it would play out was that China would attack Taiwan. There would be some type of military conflict. In the process of doing so, the United States would elect to put basically an embargo on Chinese goods. We have the embargo. We don't have the war, thank God. And maybe in some ways, this is a much better outcome. In fact, people that are in national security have argued that part of the strategy here is to break China's economy before it can go to war. If you sort of buy into the fact that there is an inevitable conflict between the United States and China, and you believe that that is going to happen in the not too distant future, then there is a lot more justification, I believe, for what we're currently seeing. If you think it's purely economic, then it makes no sense. And I think people on the left would argue that this is just a madman who's sort of executing a strategy. And maybe there's some merit to sort of the extremities that we're seeing. But I happen to believe that there may be other answers that aren't as apparent to us, on the sidelines that are also at play here. It's easy to sort of attack it, but I don't have perfect information. And so no one does except the people that are making these decisions. So it certainly feels like this has been an inevitable course that was going to take place. And I said that during the Biden administration. I mean, it was like we told clients, you must move out of China. You must move your supply chain away from China. And it was very like people looked at us like we were nuts because I mean, I got attacked a lot on social media for even saying that. Like, what are you talking about? Globalization's here to stay. Well, clearly it's not.
So what are they calling you? Like a Chinese sympathizer or a Chinese something?
Well, the opposite, right?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Basically attacking China. I think a nationalist or like sort of a crazy delusional lunatic. It's like globalization's going to end because the world that we've known, at least since the Berlin Wall fell, and you could even go back to, since World War II, is a completely different world than the one we're in right now. It's not obvious to us right now. It never is. But I fundamentally believe that the world has shifted, and we're just now come to terms with it.
What's your biggest concern then right now?
I mean, biggest sort of nightmare concern is that this turns into escalates into war.
Kinetic war, Craig. You mean
kinetic war? Yeah. So it basically breaks the Chinese economy so severely, or puts Xi in a point of desperation that the obvious answer for him becomes an attack on Taiwan, to get nationalistic fervor to basically go and create some type of military conflict because he feels like he has no choice, or feels like this is in the best interest of his economy to do so. I actually think the Chinese, I said that's like a nightmare, keep me up at night scenario. The other sort of that's the sort of worst case. If you sort of back up a couple steps, then you get into conversations or thoughts. Okay, what does this do to the financial world order? How does the United States play into that? Do we lose our reserve currency status? Do we see the bond market breaking, and therefore, like, there's all these sort of economic implications that I think are a lot less nightmarish. I mean, a war being sort of the extreme, like a nuclear war between two superpowers being an extreme, to a world where we've gone too far and we start to really destroy our place in the world because of it, which I think would be a real sad situation, and could cause a lot of heartache. The good news is we're largely outside of manufactured goods. We're enormously insulated from, our economy is enormously insulated. In many ways, we can survive without the rest of the world. And I think that's the reality of it, is we produce far more food than we consume here. We have the world's deepest set of energy supplies, many of them untapped because of environmental regulations. We have enormous amount of mining minerals. We just have we're so blessed with resources that I don't worry about a situation where America declines and we all die. I mean, I'm not in the desert, Michael. Like, I mean, you've got a different set of circumstances to worry about than I do.
That's why I'm getting out of here, Craig.
Yeah.
Go back to Ohio.
What I think about is there's a possibility that America loses an enormous amount of standing. Now move to the spectrum of things that I think are more realistic. And again, those things to me feel more extreme than likely. I think the things that I really worry about is a pretty sharp downturn in the economy due to the shock of this trade war. Is that we have basically embargoed our largest trading partner, and it is not clear to everyone, to business leaders, to entrepreneurs, that this problem is going to persist. And I actually think that is worse than having us just say, we're going to cut all trade off with China, or it's 145% and it's staying there and you can deal with it. I think if Donald Trump had come out and said it's 145%, this is the tariff, take it or leave it, I don't care. I think in some ways the country would be better off, the economy would be better off, because at that point people would start to plan contingencies. They would start to think about a post-China world. And I don't think businesses are there yet. I think most entrepreneurs believe that this will get better, that there will be a deal done, and when it happens, not if it happens, then things will go back to normal. And I would argue that's probably less likely than a scenario where we have this really large tariff on Chinese goods, and we might get some reduction, but it's going to take some time. I mean, look, the administration's been very clear. If you look at recent interviews, Donald Trump and his cabinet truly believe that tariffs are going to drive revenues to the United States, it's an income generator for the federal government, and that this is going to rebuild manufacturing. Like, even as much as in the last, I mean, today they've made those comments. And so if they're so strong on tariffs being the answer, and the fact that the stock market is not punishing them right now, it was 2 weeks ago, and the bond market's not punishing them, it was a couple of weeks ago. I think they're more likely to keep the pressure on these tariffs than they are to reduce them.
I want to share with you, my friend, I don't know if you know Matt Smith. He co-hosts a show with Doug Casey, but he did a write-up a couple days ago, and I just find it really interesting, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts on it. He wrote, "The House Armed Services Committee defense bill shatters 40 years of American economic policy. What's inside is the biggest industrial policy since World War II, and almost no one's talking about it. Here's a breakdown. For decades, the U.S. military just bought weapons from private companies. It funded R&D, placed contracts, and let the market work. Government didn't build factories, fund workers, or control supply chains. This bill blows that up. The 2025 defense bill directly funds new shipyards, missile factories, rare earth mining, AI, quantum, drone manufacturing, critical mineral loans up to $100 billion, defense workforce training programs. This is a government-engineered industry. It doesn't just buy weapons, it builds the factories, trains the workers, finances the suppliers, and manages critical industries. They're pouring billions into shipbuilding, mining, AI tech, advanced manufacturing, and more. And it's not just about making new weapons. It's about rebuilding America's ability to produce anything at all. Example, $2.5 billion to restart U.S. critical mineral production, $1 billion for automated munitions factories, $450 million for U.S. steel production for shipbuilding, $500 million to expand solid rocket motor manufacturing, $1 billion to scale commercial tech, AI, drones, quantum. The government isn't trusting the market to deliver anymore. It's setting economic priorities at the top and funding entire sectors directly. This is centrally planned economy for very national security purposes, very similar to China's model. Critical sectors are now state-guided: critical minerals, manufacturing, emerging tech, AI, quantum, autonomy, supply chains for weapons, satellites, energy. Private industry is being drafted into national service, funded and steered from Washington. Why the shift? Because Pentagon leadership finally admitted the U.S. outsourced its industrial base. China fused military plus industry decades ago. In a real conflict, the U.S. would run out of weapons and tech fast. Bottom line, the U.S. economy is quietly shifting towards a centrally directed industrial policy, especially for defense, minerals, energy, and technology. National survival now means industrial strength, and Washington is taking control. It's not just about preparing for war. It's about surviving in a world where economic strength is strategic power. Factories, minerals, supply chains, workers, all prioritized by the state. The future looks a lot less like Wall Street and a lot more like Beijing.
I mean, I would suggest that the military-industrial complex, the space race that we saw during the Cold War, so the height of the Cold War from the 1950s to really the 1980s, was much like what we're seeing right now. Now, maybe this is a more extreme version of it, but the military, I mean, Lockheed Martin is something like the 15th largest branch of the federal government if it was an agency. I mean, it receives more money than most federal agencies do. And so I would argue that this is absolutely the direction that the government's headed. But I would suggest that during the first Cold War that it was much the same. I mean, the reality is that we had, I mean, if you think about the aviation and space sector, the reason Boeing is so inept as a private company, as a capitalistic company, is because it's become so, it is a recipient of so much money from the federal government in defense and space spending. I think the reality is that a lot of businesses have benefited greatly from our military spending. And I think what is happening now is a shift that's taking place right under our feet, because we're moving, like you said, towards the Chinese model. And look, I don't know if that's a bad thing. Like, I'm ultimately a libertarian. It's fundamentally, I think, low regulation, but I don't know that it's a bad thing that our government takes a playbook from Beijing and applies it into these industries. Because if we don't, then we're not going to have if we truly want to maintain our role as the global hegemon, the private sector can't do that. I mean, we'll just be frank, is the private sector cannot make the kinds of economic sacrifices or investments to actually pull that off.
And this is the argument I make with all this. And now, mind you, I've never been over there. I've never been to China, so I can't speak from experience. But, I go off of, talking to people like yourself and others. Is China really a communist country any longer? Yes, they have a dictator. But are they, and here's the argument I get from people, pushback. I believe that they are ahead technology-wise. Are they ahead military-wise? They're making advances in that country. And here's the other thing. In the United States, are we a capitalist society any longer? I don't think so.
I mean, in many ways, the Chinese model and the American model are sort of converging. I mean, this is where it ends up, right? Like, you end up having I've spent a lot of time, I went to school in Hong Kong for part of my college experience in 1999. I was there 2 years after the handover. And I've spent a lot of time in Asia. And the most entrepreneurial people I've ever met, the most capitalistic people I've ever come across are Asian entrepreneurs. Because they came from nothing. Most of their life has been this rapid capitalization, this rapid ascension. And they know what it's like to struggle and suffer, because either they have suffered directly or their grandparents or parents had. And they're incredibly entrepreneurial because that's all they have. And they're not complacent, they're hungry, and they have no problem sort of manipulating the systems that are built, because that's how you survive and thrive in their environments. Very different than we are in the United States. I mean, in some ways we are getting our clock clean because they are more entrepreneurial and capitalistic than we are. Now, I'm not talking about the government. I'm not talking about the autocracy that is the PRC. I'm talking about the people themselves, is they're incredibly entrepreneurial. Now, they have something that we don't have, which is the sort of desire to self-sacrifice for the broader good. And there's a lot of nationalism that exist in the societies over there, far more so than we have here in the West. But if we're going to actually truly rival or maintain our presence in the world, then we're going to have to make these kinds of investments, I think. And I don't know that it's all bad. I mean, so many things came back from the Cold War. The internet, the fact that you and I are able to have a conversation today is an example of a technology that we benefited from. Satellites, GPS, that's a Cold War technology. The entire aerospace industry, the entire space industry, Cold War technologies. I mean, aviation was funded because of the Cold War. Nuclear energy, that was the Department of Energy, largely to make bombs, right? That was the original discovery, was to go blow up the atoms so that we could go beat the Japanese and the Nazis. I don't have a big issue with our government funding going to fund businesses that create technologies that make America competitive. I don't judge that in a negative way, because I think it almost is necessary. And arguably one of the most successful societies in the last 50 years has been Singapore. Singapore is not a democracy. It's a corporation. Now, it has the benefit of being a really small island city-state that can kind of manage the 4 million people that live there. But it is ran like a corporation. Now, the United States is not a corporation. Let's just be clear. It's a clusterfuck in some ways. And so we are nowhere. We don't have the nice thing about the people that live in Singapore is they have a very, very focused and directed sort of culture, in the sense that they're focused on making money and bettering their lives. And when you have a city of 4 million people, it's a lot easier. We have a lot more problems. But having said that, their model of sort of borrowing from sort of Asian traditional societies and even Chinese societal elements, and then using capitalism as a way to advance their businesses and their economy, and participate in the sort of global financial order, I think is a testament that you can do both. I mean, one of the things when you go to China, and Michael, you said you hadn't been, but if you go there, it is absolutely fascinating at the infrastructure, their airports, their train systems, things that we could never do. I mean, it takes, look at California's high-speed rail thing that they keep attempting to build. Like, the nice thing about the Chinese, for better or worse, is they can just decide to build it. Now, I'm not saying we should do this, but they have no problem displacing 100,000 people or 5 million people. That's part of the whole model. And I'm not saying that we should ever do that, but I am saying that in some ways, the needs of sort of the next generation is going to require some different thinking.
Well, and that's where, I've had Matt on a bunch, and we were talking about, he's been on a couple times over the last few months talking about the Mar-a-Lago Accord and the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and then the intention of devaluing the dollar to move us into this new financial system to mirror more of China. And when I say this to people, they're like, and you probably know this, oh, China, oh. It's like, okay, let's take a step back and look at things now, because, ultimately, I mean, this United States is not prepared. Militarily, we're not prepared.
Oh.
We are so many deficiencies. Now, there's also going to be there's going to be negatives from this too, because technology now, the more it keeps evolving, like in China, I mean, the CBDC is inevitable. I think it's already here, to be honest with you. Like, all of these mechanisms are already in place. I get hate for this. I'll get people messaging me saying I'm a CBDC supporter. I'm not, but you got to look at where we are. You do everything on your phone. People are zombies walking across the street with their phones in front of their face. Like, it's too late. You can't stop this.
No, for sure. I mean, this is, like, I think the mistake would be for us to sit there and become so, like, the challenges of the next generation are such that you need, if the United States is going to continue to be a world power, then it's going to require the kinds of investments that are demanded of us. And it is technology investments. And there is no single company, because, I mean, one of the fallacies of Western American capitalism is that corporate executives are held accountable every single quarter. We moved into a society, and perhaps rightfully so, where, because there was so much corruption and so much manipulation of the stock market, these businesses, where you want full disclosures, you want transparent markets, you want people to know what a company looks like on a regular basis. But when you do that, the incentives are aligned for companies to think about their own self-interest for the next quarter. And what's happened is a lot of these American companies, these American CEOs that took over these fantastic brands that had done an enormous amount of R&D on their markets and on their technology, it was obvious to them to go to China to benefit from this trade arbitrage, this cost arbitrage of basically buying labor and benefiting from the lack of environmental and human rights regulations that we have here in the United States, and basically use all of this R&D and intellectual property as a way to essentially take those products, take them over, produce them a lot cheaper, sell them back to Americans at effectively the same prices. So they've cut their cost of goods sold significantly by doing so. And they were rewarded, rightfully so, for delivering an enormous amount of shareholder value. You cannot judge that. Now, you can say that this is wrong, but this is the way our economy is built. And if I were CEO of any of these companies, I would have done the same thing, because it only makes sense. It doesn't make me disloyal, or it just makes me a smart business person to take advantage of the opportunities. The problem that you've got is, if we're truly going to rival and compete on the world stage with China, we have to sort of borrow from their playbook. They've taken the best of the United States and they've applied it, and they've ripped us off, and they've stolen our IP, and they've taken the best of what we do.
Which we allowed them to do. That's what's really funny to me.
We absolutely allowed them to do.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. People are like, because China stole from us. I'm like, okay, all right, which politician was fucking the prostitute? Who let them into the universities to, be part of the colleges and infiltrate that technology? Who let them buy the intellectual property in the United States? We let that all happen. So do you blame them for doing it?
Jack Welch, and I think, Jack Welch, the story of Jack Welch has gotten sort of tarnished in recent years. But the truth is, Jack Welch, at one point when GE was the most valuable company in the world, sort of engineered one of the greatest American intellectual property handovers to the Chinese. These big GE power systems, the GE light bulbs, like General Electric was a great American company, started by, Edison, and basically took all of that IP, American ingenuity, American technology, American market understanding, and transferred all of that and built an enormous amount of value for himself and for GE shareholders for many, many years, until the Chinese sort of copied what we were doing. And, Jack Welch is handing over the keys, and all of a sudden, now GE is practically an irrelevant relic, except for aircraft engines, where the Chinese have not figured out how to actually compete in aviation yet. The fact is that there's probably very few markets outside of healthcare, due to regulations and aerospace, that GE is even relevant anymore as a world leader. And it's because all of that IP transfer that we did. And now what's happening, and here's the other thing, Michael, that I think is really interesting is, and I think this trade war is really interesting because effectively what's happening is these orders are being canceled by American businesses. So American businesses went to contract manufacturers like a year ago, because what happens, it takes 6 months to a year to get something produced. Like, a lot of Americans think that things just show up, like a factory's literally printing my iPhone today and it's just going to show up tomorrow, because that's Americans see the UPS delivery driver and think, oh, this stuff happens in a day, or it happens in a week. They produce it, they put it on an airplane, it comes here. That's what most Americans think of supply chains. The reality is that if I wanted to produce, let's say backpacks, a pretty generic, easy to produce product, there's not a lot of ingenuity that comes into a backpack. I went to a contract manufacturer. My lead time on that is probably 4 to 6. In a normal world, it's probably 4 to 6 months. It takes from the time that I place the order to the time that it's produced. If I've made any kind of modifications to that backpack, it's going to be a 4 to 6 month process. And so these products are being produced, and now this trade war is happening, and they've run and they've built they've done the production lines. They have all these orders, and Americans say this 145% tariff, and like, I'm not taking delivery of it. So if you're a factory owner in China and you've got 1 million backpacks sitting in your warehouse and the Americans have abandoned you because they're not paying you for these backpacks because they don't want them delivered, what do? Well, you could either throw them away, which seems pretty stupid, or you could go sell them. And what is the most natural place to sell them is to get on TikTok, go take the marketing of the brands that you were providing wholesale for, use an AI engine to rip them off so it's not Chinglish. Like, I mean, one of the things is like, if the old days is on Amazon, it's not, and I'm not even talking like 5 years ago, you would go read these ads on Amazon and be like, I don't know that I trust this product because it's written in Chinese. But what's happened with these natural language AI engines is that the Chinese entrepreneurs can look like an American company, can talk like an American company, can market like an American company. And with TikTok, they're able to actually market direct to consumers. And look, have no doubt that the PRC, which owns TikTok, is manipulating the algorithm to make sure that those Chinese brands are actually getting front and center in the American consumer consciousness. Like, I would too if I were the Chinese. These people are smart. And so what's happening is all this excess capacity that's built up in China, these Chinese entrepreneurs, these Chinese factory owners are now directly marketing to American consumers and saying, like, okay, there's a tariff. Like, fine, we'll pay it. And what they've done is they've cut out the distributor. They've cut out the retailer. They've cut out all of the intermediaries that are from the factory to the consumer by basically taking over that playbook themselves. And it's quite brilliant. And so why shouldn't we learn from these people? That's the whole thing of saying this is not America and this is not American capitalism. I say, look, let's go beat them at their own game.
And at this point, though, how far behind are we from them, and how long would it take to, get some kind of to be on some kind of even playing field?
Well, I think in terms of R&D, we're perhaps still ahead of them. I think the thing that you have to remember is that supply chains win wars. Like, the reason that the American South lost the Civil War was entirely due to the fact that the South had no manufacturing. All of the factories were actually in the North. The South was, a lot of landowners, aristocracy that were quite wealthy and frankly quite influential. But the factories, the supply chains were all in the North. And for the first part of the Civil War, the South was actually winning. It wasn't until those factories really started to gain ground in the North and they moved from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy and really turned up the supply chains before we started to see a change of the Civil War. And so when you think about that if we're going to compete, we have to have a manufacturing base. And I think, look, credit to the Trump administration for getting this. Credit to folks that are in national defense for getting this, because you have to have that. And I think what's happening is we have realized that if we want to have an industrial base here, then you have to have that if you're going to go to war. I mean, here's one of the craziest stats is, you would agree, Michael, that OPEC is a cartel, right?
Yes.
I mean, clearly it is. There's no denial. It owns 38% of the world's oil supply. Still sound like a cartel to you?
Yes.
38%. Put that in mind. If you take the top 10 container vessel owners, these are ship lines like Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, Costco, MSC, etc. Those top 10 companies own 90% of the container supply in the world. They also are not subject to U.S. antitrust laws. Like, they are exempt. They can plan their schedules together, pull capacity off. They're allowed to, under international law recognized by the United States, that they're allowed to effectively collaborate on schedules and in many ways do cartel-like things. I mean, when OPEC wants to move oil prices up, Saudi Arabia pulls barrels off the market. That's the way it works. And so we have a problem in the United States that if you go look at the number one container company in terms of American-owned container vessel company, it is the number 29th, is the highest ranked American-owned container vessel company that has less than, I think, 10 basis points of the entire container industry. So if you think about this from the perspective of, let's imagine that America and China are in conflict with one another. Let's imagine that this is 1933, 1934 Europe, and we're about to move to World War II. And 10 years from now, or I'm sorry, 100 years from now, when they look back at what happened, they will be talking about, it's so obvious that there was going to be a world war with China and the United States. And we can't fight that war because we don't have the infrastructure, but we also don't have the global shipping. We don't have the supply chain infrastructure to fight a world war. We would be wiped out almost immediately. China knows this. They have it. And so they do commingle their private market businesses. They build ships, they build container ships that are dual purpose. They build them for consumer purposes and civilian purposes, but they also build them for military purposes, the same ships. And in order for us to compete, we have to play their game, because if we don't, we'll end up in a situation where we become irrelevant.
What do you think then? See, to me, also the one of the drawbacks or negatives from this is obviously it's going to be more centralized, more government control. But for small entrepreneurs, case in point in your field, the independent truck drivers delivering to the independent businesses, is it going to make it difficult, if not impossible, for them to succeed?
Why?
Just being that the corporate conglomerates, the costs will be too high. I'm speaking general here, but
I think it depends on what you mean by succeed. So I think in a short-term basis with the trade war, it is going to be very difficult. It's going to be a rocky, however long, 6 months to a year, as the economy adjusts. I think the thing that I would suggest is that the Trump administration went too far, too fast with the trade war. Like it basically did what was inevitable to me, was there was going to be a fracturing of global trade or bilateral trade with China and the United States. And it would likely happen because China did something that offended or threatened the United States or Taiwan or something to that effect. But now Trump decided to just go all in and just rip the Band-Aid off and let's just basically do an embargo on China. I would have liked to have had more time for American businesses to have made those adjustments. So short term, it's absolutely going to be painful for small businesses that have any kind of Chinese vulnerability. Long term, I think you can have a larger state government funded military industrial complex and have a private sector. I mean, Michael, I don't agree with the fact that we've never had large government centrally controlled businesses funded by the federal government. I mean, the whole Cold War was about that. You don't have to go far in history to realize that much of the we're talking the internet, our energy infrastructure. I mean, the interstate highway system was built, frankly, because of military Cold War purposes. Like the reason we have an interstate highway system is because Eisenhower believed it was the best way to basically prepare the United States for an inevitable conflict with the Soviet Union. Like every 5 miles on the interstates, there's a straightaway because the airplanes can land, because they knew that if the Soviets were going to come attack the United States, that they would land on the highway. But we as consumers benefited from that. And I think you would also agree that if you think about it, like the Department of Defense invented GPS. The Department of Defense invented the internet. The Department funded, not say that their people invented it, but they funded the enablement of the internet, the enablement of GPS. They funded these technologies. And so I think frankly, that has been part of the challenge of the last 50 years is we've lost so much. Like look at aerospace. I mean, 1960s was the sort of climatic moment of aerospace innovation in America. That's when the supersonic Concorde, that was a European thing, but like It also was funded through Cold War methods. But like, it's amazing to me that the born on date of the first 737 was closer to the Wright brothers' first flight than it is to today. Like, think about that for a second. Like, the 737 is about as far as we've gone in commercial aviation. Like, the 747 is closer to the Wright brothers' first flight than we are to today. Aviation has been stunted because once the government decided it didn't want to fund the space race and the aerospace race against the Soviets, we lost a lot of that innovation that is required because these things are big ticket. Now, some of it's happening. We've seen things like SpaceX that have popped up that sort of taken the role of NASA and the Department of Defense of launching satellites. We're starting to see venture capital and private capital fund things like supersonic commercial aviation with Boom Arrow, but these things are still in the R&D phase. I frankly am enthusiastic to see, as someone who actually loves technology, I'd be enthusiastic to see our money spent on developing our businesses. And I think it's a much better return on investment than going to the Middle East and trying to protect trade lanes to protect our interest. I mean, imagine how much money we have spent in Afghanistan and in Iraq to basically obliterate societies that are over there. We've not only destroyed millions of lives of people that live in these countries, but we've also taken trillions of dollars of our own money into wars that we get no return on investment. And to me, I would much rather that happen at home. I mean, the best thing to happen to the United States is fracking. The fracking revolution has changed everything. And so I don't know. I'm pretty bullish on America in that sense.
What about AI and its role in your field in the next, say, 5 to 8 years?
Yeah, look, AI, I mean, is data and supply chains are messy. And, ultimately having technology that's able to take big data sets and come out with conclusions and find inefficiencies is absolutely important. You're seeing that applied in all sorts of different applications. So, if you're going to have autonomous vehicles and robotics, you're going to have some form of AI that's driving that. So, absolutely.
They have them here. They have these Waymo cars all over the place in Phoenix.
They do. They're still rudimentary. I mean, the leaps and bounds of what we'll have over the next 5 to 10 years and autonomous is going to be pretty tremendous. I mean, the issue is autonomous vehicles, and the problem in an 80,000 pound vehicle is that it's a much different use case than a 4,000 pound van that's driving around Phoenix. You're driving an 80,000 pound vehicle down the highway. You have a very different set of issues to contend with. And so that's why we haven't seen driverless trucks in mass really take hold. It will happen. AI will become an enabling technology to make that happen.
You think it'll get there then?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think eventually autonomous. I think all this stuff is a matter of time. Battery electric or electric trucks will get there. They will be there, but they're not there now. The problem is the regulators in California have not figured out we're not there yet. But in 10 years, the battery technology will be such that we will be able to have over-the-road trucks, heavy-duty electric trucks. Autonomous trucking will happen. It's probably a decade out. And I don't think it's a technology limitation. I think, frankly, it's a societal issue. I think the question is, when is society ready to have driverless trucks? Like, frankly, we should have automated air traffic control systems today and automated. Like, I'm a pilot. 99.99% of what a pilot does can be fully automated. I mean, drones do it today. The pilot is often there in case something goes wrong, and the pilot's there because the regulators think that they need to be there, the unions say that they need to be there, and consumers are far more comfortable with a human pilot on board than they are a computer. That's just the reality. But the planes can take off and land themselves today. Like, that technology exists. That is not something the regulatory environment says that's not the case. And so that is the issue you're dealing with, is sort of the technology will be there before the regulatory environment gets there.
Well, and I wonder, with that, like, in Ohio or some, Midwest with snow, rain, whatever, ice, how will they program these AI or these algorithms to say if this car or truck hits an ice patch, to pump the brake, or?
Yeah. So some of the really cool things happening in AI is, so there's a company that's in autonomous trucking. So the typical model for autonomous is you take a vehicle and you put them out in the wild. So these Waymo taxis are not there to generate a profit for Waymo. Like they're spending exponentially more money than they're generating. The reason they're there is to basically collect data. They want enough real world reps where that vehicle is put into a real world environment that they can then take back to the labs, take all this data, crunch it through some type of machine learning or AI application to sort of say, in this event, this happens, this is the likelihood of what is going to happen. This is how you should react to it. There are companies, so that was the old model of putting things in real world. And now what's happening, which I think is pretty remarkable, is that some of the newer age autonomous companies are not actually putting these things in the field. They're running simulations. So they put these cars, so the car itself or the truck, the autonomous vehicle, thinks, because it's programmed to think, that it's in a real world environment. And what they're doing is they're able to essentially throw everything at them that they possibly can find to recreate these types of scenarios that will help these engines learn that much faster. There's enough data in these autonomous vehicles to sort of understand what could take place. It just, when you combine scenarios, like as a pilot, most of the times accidents or crashes are not caused by one thing. They're usually caused by a culmination of errors. And you can see this in the Washington, D.C. Helicopter runs into the airplane thing. That is most likely, and we've seen that the pilot of the helicopter was not listening or not responding to commands to basically move off the flight path. But that wasn't the only thing that took place there. So we have a pilot who did not listen and obey the command. We had an overworked air traffic control system. It's at night. It's over one of the most congested airspaces in the world. You've got military helicopters that should have no business flying right next to civilian, one of the busiest airports in the world. It's at night. Visibility is not great. As a pilot flying into a dense urban area, it's hard to see. You probably had an altimeter failure. I've had one myself. My altimeter went out. 300 feet, 500 feet, and 1,000 feet, particularly at night, you have no idea. Like, it's hard to know that. You think the stuff. Military helicopters are junk when it comes to technology. Like, everybody's like, oh, this is Department of Defense. These things should be really high tech. You've seen too many movies. If you've ever looked at a military helicopter, you know that it's like, this is just trash avionics. And so the comedy of errors problem is actually the biggest issue for autonomous vehicles, because again, you can simulate in a real world environment, you can get a data about one thing happening. But when you're talking about the most likely examples are of things that will go wrong, are things that you need, and this is where a lot of the autonomous technology really needs to get before consumers will adopt these things across every single situation. You need to prepare the autonomous engines and the AI engines that drive these autonomous vehicles for the most extreme set of examples. So let's say a snowstorm in Ohio with sheets of ice, deer runs out in front of you. You got a kid that also runs out because he's playing in the snow. And you have all these scenarios, an extremely unlikely event to ever recreate in the field. But in a simulation environment, you can absolutely do that. And so that's what some of these technology companies are doing. And I think that's how they'll get there.
Then you have factor in public transportation, right? That'll be inevitable.
In terms of what?
Buses, Uber will be...
Yeah, for autonomy. I mean, you're seeing it in Singapore. You're seeing it in Japan. You're seeing it in Dubai. Absolutely.
What are all these Americans going to do then that get put out of work by...
I mean, we have a demographic challenge. I mean, the reality is, like, we are, as an entire species, we are, except in, like, Latin America and Africa, we are actually... like, our population is peaking. And without immigration into the United States, our population would have already peaked. And so I fundamentally believe that the technology will be of such come on time where at about the same time that we start to see significant, and we already seen it. I mean, we have, and even in this economy, we have low unemployment. And if it wasn't for immigration, we have incredibly tight employment. And that's where some of this automation will be really important.
I know I'm running out of time here with you, but one last thing I want to ask, as we talked here now for almost 70 minutes, how do you feel in both the short term and the long term for the United States in relation to your field of supply chain logistics?
I'm incredibly bullish. I mean, here's the great thing, Michael, is supply chains win wars. Supply chains drive economies. And the United States has outsourced its entire supply chain to China effectively. And what is happening right now that we're being forced to reckon with, and it's not fun and it's not easy, is that now we are moving a lot of that back to the U.S. So you think about what I do. I'm in the middle of providing data and context to supply chains. Let's go back to where we started this conversation. Back in 2016, when I started this business, everybody said supply chains are boring. Nothing ever happens. The reality is that there's always things happening. And we're in a whole, like, I hate to use the word new order because it makes me feel like I need one of these hats, right? Like the whole world new order. But I think what's happening is that we're shifting in a pretty profound time in history where, from where I sit, is we're going to see an entirely new type of economy, an entirely new type of structure. And I can't help but think that the world of supply chain is going to become far more relevant and thought of than it is today, and important. And so I'm incredibly bullish as a supply chain practitioner and someone who sort of sits in the world, the center of that this is a pretty exciting time for what I do. And I think America's going to win because we have everything we need. We have natural resources. We have the world's largest energy supplies. And here's the great thing is we've gone through this world where you're supposed to decarbonize everything. And we look at Europe. They've turned off all Germany's been turning off its nuclear plants. California's decommissioning its nuclear plants. And what we've learned is you can't do that stuff. Like that is counter to your interest. What we've learned is you have to have the mechanics of your economy. You have to have the highways. You have to have the infrastructure. You have to have this physical world to make everything else work. Otherwise, you wouldn't have water. I mean, Michael, you could do a whole episode on the supply chain of water into Arizona, and I think it would be one of the most fascinating conversations because there's a lot of stuff that goes on that makes that possible. Like fossil fuels make that possible. Everyone's like, what are you talking about? I was like, well, that stuff gets trucked on diesel. Like all that chlorine, all of that stuff has to get to the water treatment plant that enables you guys to drink out of the desert. Like there's just so much happening. And I think it's pretty cool to be in that center of the whole world because this is like, we are remaking our economy as we speak. And I think it's pretty insane.
It is a remarkable time to be talking about this and to live in this country.
Absolutely. And like it's depressing. It's challenging right now because there's an enormous amount of frustration. I have it. Business leaders who know nothing about supply chain have it. It's enormously frustrating to see that we are so vulnerable and the fact that we can't actually decouple from China. That's enormously frustrating. Like that should frustrate every single person. Even the most diehard globalist should be frustrated at the fact that we don't have the ability to decouple. The reason that this is stressful is because we have allowed that to happen. And I think we're at a point where we are in the construction of an entirely new type of generation. And I don't know, it feels cool to be in the midst of that.
And this decoupling from China, I mean, this has taken 4 decades to get to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it on China specifically, I mean, Nixon went over in was it 1976 or something? Or 1978? I guess Carter was in office in 1973. I can't remember when Kissinger and Nixon went over, but we opened up the economy when Mao was in, I think it was in 1973. And that was sort of the first foray of China saying, I'm willing to open up, my economy a little bit. And then I think it was 1978 when then leader Deng decided that, hey, we should create some type of capitalistic economy, and allowed the gray economy to sort of exist, that was sort of existed, but nobody wanted to talk about it, and said, hey, we should orientate our economy, because he saw what was happening in Korea and Japan, and was saying that, hey, they can have their cake and eat it too. I mean, one of the crazy things about Japan is, and I read this book years ago, written by a professor, and he said if you looked at Marx and you looked at communism, there's only one society in the world that actually operates as a communal country, and that's the Japanese. Like, the Japanese, if you know anything about their countries, are incredibly compliant. So he was arguing that they're the only true communist, because for years they had one-party rule. I mean, nobody challenged the one party that was in power. That's changed now. And they were willing to sacrifice for the whole. And his argument was it is a form of communism. Now, that is offensive to a Japanese, and maybe offensive to people who don't want to talk about that. But it is, we are, since certainly 1978, this is a new, it took China really 40 years to sort of rival the US. They moved really quickly. We're going to be able to move a lot of the supply chain elements back much faster, because we already have the infrastructure to do so. But it's going to be a couple painful years, frankly.
Oh, you think it'll be that long? Potentially, if not longer.
I mean, periods of it have already been happening, but I think it's going to be a couple years before it's truly smooth sailing. Like, I don't think it's going to take 4 years before a business gets to move back. But the time we're truly decoupled, if that's the end game, it's not going to happen overnight.
Where can people find you, Craig?
Yeah, so I'm at Freight Alley on X, and FreightWaves, if you're looking for supply chain or logistics news, you can hit freightwaves.com.
I appreciate you doing this, and I could spend 3 hours talking to you about all this, but I look forward to continuing to follow your work, and more conversations ahead.
Appreciate it, Michael.
Mic drop.